Welcome to episode 22 of Real Health Radio.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel, and today we have another episode where I'm interviewing a guest. And today's guest is Virgie Tovar. And Virgie is an author and one of the USA's leading experts and lecturers on fat discrimination and body image. She's a plus-size style writer for BuzzFeed, the founder of BABECAMP, and the creator of the hashtag losehatenotweight. Virgie is also edited the anthology Hot and Heavy, Fierce Fat Girls on Life, Love and Fashion. She holds a master's degree in Human Sexuality with a focus on the intersection of body size, race, and gender. Virgie has been featured by the New York Times, MTV, Al Jazeera, NPR, Yahoo Health, Yahoo Front Page, the San Francisco Chronicle, Huffington Post, Cosmopolitan Magazine Online, Bus Magazine, and was recently named in Women in Power issue of San Francisco Magazine. So I became aware of Virgie about a year ago. She was someone I kept hearing referenced on podcasts where guests would say how much they loved her work and what she had to say. So I started reading her articles and watching videos and really loved what she was talking about. She was talking about topics like weight discrimination and privilege and patriarchy and feminism. But rather than talking about this stuff at a general or a surface level, she was able to give proper responses and really show how much of a deep understanding she had with these areas. So I decided to invite her on the show and we got to chat about all of these things. And this is one of my favorite podcasts that are recorded. And it's perfect that this is where we're going to end the year, as this one is being released on New Year's Eve. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing what 2016 brings. But for now, enjoy the conversation that I had with Virgie. So, hey, Virgie, I'm excited to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you.
And so you're an activist, you're an expert, you're a lecturer on fat discrimination and body image, and this is something that we're going to cover today in detail. But to start off with, why don't you explain how you got into this line of work? Do you want to talk about your upbringing and your own experiences that impacted on your chosen career?
Yeah, a lot of times when I'm talking about my origin story or how I got started with this, it's began even before I was born in a lot of ways. I come from a fat family. If you look at pictures of my great-grandfather, for example, he's a short, stocky man, and he has a similar body to me. Like I look at my grandfather, and I look at the women in my family and I see my own body, broad shoulders, narrow hips, a belly, a sort of like round face. And I can see it in my lineage. And it's like so interesting kind of, looking back at images and thinking about the sort of like the history of the body I'm in right now. And it was inevitable that I was going to come into this world a bigger bodied person. I was a fat baby, and a fat child. And, it was the first few years of my life, I would say from, the time I was born to about 4, almost 5 years old, I was not introduced to body shame. I was not made aware that anything was wrong with me. So I had awareness around the fact that I was bigger than other children. I remember being in preschool at the age of 4, and I knew I was the biggest kid in the class. And I had a little boyfriend named Ray, who was who was the smallest kid in the class. And I was aware of our difference in dimensions. I remember even, when we would, hug and do 4-year-old romantic things. I remember taking into account the physics of our bodies. Like I remember, I would for example, one of the things we liked to do was we would sort of have this huggy tussle thing that we did after school every day. And I remember I would lie on the floor because I knew that he was lighter than me. And he would kind of jump on top of me and we would kind of hug and stuff. And so there was like kind of the recognition of the difference in size, but there was no emotional association. There was no education around what that meant. And so it didn't mean anything to me. In fact, I remember, at around the same time, I would love to come home after school and take all my clothes off. And, I'd start in the bathroom, and there's a long hallway in my parents' home from the bathroom to the kitchen. And I would take all my clothes off in the bathroom and run down the hallway to the kitchen. And I would stop at the end of the hallway and I would jiggle, my whole body. And it felt so pleasurable. I remember just how much joy it gave me to feel the sensations. And it's so interesting because I did not, until very recently, I had blocked out all of these memories. These first several years of my life where I had no shame. I hadn't been indoctrinated into shame yet. And it wasn't until, I started to heal my relationship to my body that I remembered that there was that time before. And so at about 5 years old, I was introduced to kindergarten, and it was K through 6. So there were children who were 5 and there were children who were 12, and we were sharing a school. And I think it was this variation in age that really began, that really kind of became the impetus for the education in fat shame. So, at around 5, I was introduced to the idea that I was fat, and that fat was a bad thing, that fat was a very bad thing. It was the worst thing that you could be, and that you should change your body by any means necessary. And this is actually pretty in line with certainly data that's been collected in the U.S. By the time children are 5, they understand that, when a researcher asks children who are 5 if they'd rather be fat or lose an arm, they choose losing an arm. So there's sort of like, there's already that educational component happening at that very young age. And so,
and if I'm remembering research correctly, there seems to be this really big shift at certain ages, like something happens between 4 and 5, and then something happens between like 9 and 10, where the percentage and the proportions just jump exponentially. And it's like, I don't know what happens at that time, but there's a real demarcation where it significantly goes up.
Yeah, interesting. I think that at about 4 or 5, you begin to be sort of incorporated into the culture and the social norms and social rewards and punishment. And at that time, it's sort of an educational period. Like, you're aware that there's a punishment process for not adhering. And then I imagine within a few years, you internalize that reward and punishment system, and it begins to affect your worldview. And so, that's what I'm kind of gleaning from what you're saying. But for years, that education in the fact that my body was wrong, that I was bad, and that, I should change my body by any means necessary, went on for years, from about 5 to about, 18 years old. My education, like my experience from, kindergarten all the way through graduation of high school, was deeply impacted by incessant teasing and bullying. I don't even like to use those words because this is more sinister than that. Like, this was like systematic emotional terrorism or something. Right. It was just like incessant. Every day I was reminded of my body, that my body was wrong, that my body was something I should be ashamed of, and that other people deserved to make fun of it because it was my own fault that I hadn't fixed it, that I hadn't made it a thin body. And I thoroughly incorporated all these messages. By the time I was 17, I really believed that I was worthless. I really believed that my body was like my worst enemy, that I would do anything to get rid of this body. I used to have ideas, like thoughts about, taking a knife and cutting off all my fat and wishing that I had, quote unquote, the discipline to be an anorexic or a bulimic. And these are actually very common thoughts for fat people and fat women in particular. And so I sort of, and this is interesting, like in this really dark moment, there's kind of this pivotal change, the sort of the first moment where the story begins to change. I really locate, as sexual debut. So at 17, I'm like a horny teenager, and I'm also a total nerd. So it's like, I feel like I have no outlet for my desire for like sexuality, romance, flirtation, because I just am not allowed to be. I'm not allowed to be sexual or, feminine really at all because I'm a fat person. And so I'm like, I've got this like whole repression thing going. And one night, it's Thanksgiving break. I'm allowed to stay up late because there's no school the next day. And a commercial comes on for a phone personal service, which is called telepersonals. And this is before like the big chat room boom happened. And like, this was circa 1999. So I immediately see the potential of this telephone personal service. I'm like, oh my God, I can charm people with my intelligence and kindness. And then I'll like, and then they'll maybe get over the fact that I'm not attractive. Maybe they'll get over the fact that I'm not thin. And I can sort of like, and this is the opportunity I've been waiting for my whole life, right? Like, I can disembody myself and show people how wonderful I am without the like burden of my unattractive body. And that was really the thought process that I had. And so I went for it full force. And I pretended to be 18 and, kind of went through these like really shoddy verification processes. And so I was, in the middle of this like marketplace of dudes all of a sudden, and it was exhilarating, right? And of course I got a ton of attention. And that led to me finally going out on dates. And what was so fascinating at the time was that my experience romantically, sexually, dating wise was against everything that I had been told about myself. I had been told that I was not attractive. I had been told that no one would ever love me. No one would ever want to sleep with me. No one would ever want to date me and certainly not marry me. And what I found when I entered dating was that was absolutely not true. And if you can imagine, it's almost like I liken it to, being told that Santa Claus isn't real or something like that. Like, you have this completely I was fully convinced that I was undesirable. And then all of a sudden I find that this is not the truth at all. And it just blew my mind. And I remember, I think even at that time, I began to ask myself, if they're lying to me about this, what else are they lying to me about? And so that was kind of like the very, very beginning, like the seeds of, I think, the change in the story in a lot of ways. And kind of as I went further into adulthood, I had these other experiences. Like I was introduced to feminism at UC Berkeley, and that changed my life. Just the idea that I was allowed to have autonomy as a woman, that there was nothing wrong with me, that I shouldn't have to feel shame just because I'm fat or whatever. I was introduced to body image, the body image conversation for the first time at that time. And then I kind of keep going. I end up dating someone who is incredibly fat positive. He's actually a thin person. And he just advocated for me. He doggedly reminded me of my worth. When I would come up against fat phobia culturally, because he was thin, he felt much more emboldened to fight on my behalf. I think he felt like, I think it was like his thinness allowed him to have a particular kind of experience when he was with me. And so like my fat body, coupled with his thin body made us like hyper visible. And he was very aware of this, and he was very, very supportive of me. And that was a huge moment for me. And I think like the sort of final frontier in terms of like really going into activism, was I went to graduate school for sexuality studies. I was really interested in studying fat women. And I began to do research. I began to interview fat women about their lives, about, how their fat bodies had affected their sexuality and their gender and the way that they dressed. And it was fascinating. And what I found was that very few people were writing about this. Very few people were sharing their experiences at that time. This was maybe 2010, 2011. And I just, and as I did the research, people were introducing me more and more to things like fat conferences. And do you know this person? Have you read this book? And I just kind of fell down this amazing, magical rabbit hole of fat activism and fat community. And I was utterly seduced by this entire experience. And the tenet was that I didn't have to diet anymore, that I could live my life completely and fully on my terms at my current size, and that there were people, friends and lovers who would care about me, who would love me, and who would support me at this size. And it just, if you can imagine after the journey that I went through, hearing something like that just completely revolutionized my worldview. And it became kind of my mission to show people that this was an option for them too.
Wow. So you talk about the messages that you were constantly getting about not being good enough and fat being unattractive and all of that. Was that coming from inside your home as well, or is it more from outside?
It was more from outside. Inside the home, my mother and grandmother, my mother has, and I think still does, but certainly had extreme eating disorder. And she was very, and it was hard, right? Like when you're a young mother, which she was, she would constantly try to counteract the experiences I had at school of being teased and tortured kind of emotionally. She would try to counteract them with like messages of acceptance, but then I think in her own kind of frustration with what I was dealing with, she would also sometimes teach me how to do disordered eating behaviors. And so it was very complicated, right? I think at the end of the day, she wanted me to recognize that I was beautiful and perfect. But she also had her own education and having been a fat girl growing up and how hard it is. And she had through disordered behavior, lost a lot of weight. So she would, teach me things like, how this is how you stop, like, what we need in order to lose weight, we need to stop loving the foods that make us fat. And so she would teach me, like, if you eat too much of a thing that you really like and it makes you ill, you never want to eat it again, and you can cross it off the list and you can move on to the next thing. So this was stuff that like I was learning from my mother at, age 9. And again, what's so hard is like, I very much locate this behavior within a loving, parental experience, right? She was like a young mom who was really confused about how to tell her fat kid how to navigate the world. My grandmother,
she probably thought she was helping when she was giving you this advice.
Yeah, I think she thought that she was helping, or even more than that, I think that she was like at the end of her emotional resources for empowerment, and was like, okay, this is all I've got for you, and this isn't working, so I'm gonna give you this tool as well. And then I also grew up with my grandmother, who, was also very loving and accepting. I'm also a dieter, so I mean, I did not experience shaming in my household, but I certainly grew up in a household where dieting was part of life.
Okay. And it's interesting, at the beginning of that, you were talking about looking back on photos of past generations and everyone having the same body type and shape that you do. And I've had this same experience with myself, like thinking back to when I was young, and I've got a brother and a sister, and all of us have very different body shapes, but we had those body shapes from when we were really young. And it's as if we've just gone into adult life and kept the exact same thing. And I mean, you've had a very different experience to what I have, but I was always the kid at school who was tiny. Like I look back at my class photos and it looks like they've put me in the wrong year when they've been taking the photo, because I was just that much smaller than everyone else. And in my sort of early 20s, I was the guy who was constantly trying to put on weight, and just no matter what I do, no matter how much I'd eat, it just wouldn't happen. I would have like the opposite of dieting, where I would be eating tons and tons and keeping it up for weeks on end and following these different programs, and then standing on the scale at the end of that period and I've lost weight. And just really understanding the fertility of it all. And I think this is part of why I've gone into the work that I do, and very much get on board with all of this stuff in terms of fighting against weight discrimination, etc., is because I've seen from the other side of it, like how difficult it can be. And I know that if I can experience this at my weight, that the same thing's going to happen all along the spectrum.
Right, exactly.
And so one of the terms, I mean, you use the word fat and suggest that people use the term fat as opposed to using things like overweight and obese. And if someone's never heard this as an idea, like, do you want to explain like why people should be doing this, or why this is important?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, so I do not like words like obese and overweight, because they're medical pathology, terms. And, they're also, for me, I don't know. I mean, I think like obesity, and the word obese is associated with, disease, which I don't, I don't see fatness as a disease. And I think overweight is kind of another sort of arbitrary pathologizing word, because I don't really understand like over what weight. Like we as a culture have arbitrarily placed a quote unquote normal and healthy weight all over the place, even in just the past 100 years. So it strikes me as very arbitrary, and it's kind of a useless word. And also it's sort of, again, like a medical pathology sort of term in my mind. I think for me, I'm drawn to the word fat because I have so much healing to do around that word. I've already done so much healing around it. And it was the word that was used to silence me for years, and to make me invisible and to make me wish that I wasn't myself. And so I think that there's like a therapeutic element to changing my relationship to that word. I think also for me, it connotes kind of an intimacy. Like when I'm around other people who lovingly use that word, who understand what I've been through, perhaps because they've been through it, or perhaps because they know, because they went out of their way to find out about it, or they had a sibling or a close friend who went through it. There's something very intimate to me about using that word with people who I trust. I think that it certainly is a fraught word. It certainly is a political word. And I think that the third thing that I want to talk about for me is that there is kind of an element of provocation when I use that word. I'm sort of I'm a provocative person. Like I enjoy the idea of kind of pushing pushing the sleeping dragon, right? Like we have so much. Fat shame is an integral part of daily life in the West. And when I use that word, it sort of makes visible this thing that we're all doing kind of silently. Many of us are kind of have internalized fat shaming attitudes and fat phobia. And we kind of tiptoe around it with polite language. And then when I say fat, all of a sudden, I don't know, in my mind, it's like poking something that's there, and that we as a culture feel deeply uncomfortable about. So I think all those things, like that's my relationship to the word fat.
Okay. And if someone who isn't themselves fat or doesn't identify as themselves as fat is using that word, do you see a problem with it?
I think right now in this cultural moment, that word means different things in different contexts. Certainly, we're not at a point culturally where fat means the same thing to everybody. So I think sometimes, like, for example, I can go from one environment. Like yesterday, I went to a fat clothing swap where we're all using the word fat. The word fat is all over the walls. It's very fun. And it again feels very intimate, very joyful. I could walk out of that space and then someone on the street could call me fat, and in a way that feels really mean-spirited. And, even though it's the exact same word, the context can really affect me entirely differently emotionally. So I think, like, for me, it's not so much a matter of who's using the word, like whether you're thin or not, but rather the kind of context and the kind of emotional energy of how it's being used.
Okay. Sure, because it is something I'm coming around to more of. I mean, I have some uneasiness using it because I don't identify with that word. But the more I hear people talk about it, the more it makes sense. And I see the problems with using the words like overweight, that, as you say, it means, well, over what? Like, who gets to judge over what? And then in terms of obese and the links that then has with medical issues.
Right.
So with weight discrimination, let's talk about that for a little bit. So for someone who is oblivious to weight discrimination as an issue, do you want to give some examples of how this is happening in our society and maybe things that people wouldn't sort of instantly think of?
Yeah. I mean, I have a few sort of, like, on the one hand, the one that people are most familiar with is interpersonal fat shaming. So, somebody calling somebody a name out on the street or whatever. That's very interpersonal style fat shaming. And that's kind of the thing that we associate with fat shaming and fat phobia. There's a lot of examples that are much more subtle. And I think that people might even mistake them with being innocuous. So various kinds of things. So like internalized fat phobia can look like the avoidance of being around fat people. So befriending fat people or dating fat people. Another way it manifests institutionally, several ways. Like one that I've become more and more familiar with is things like seating. So, something like on the train or on a plane. I've noticed that in spaces that are shared, where seating is happening, these are arenas where fat phobia manifests a lot, both interpersonally and kind of just institutionally. So, for example, and to kind of like take a more pointed example that happened recently, to me, actually, or rather that I had kind of an experience where I was interfacing with this. I had an event that was designed. It was about an event about fat intimacy, an event about fat people reading about their lives and talking about their lives. And one of the concerns for me was seating. There were a lot of chairs, but a lot of the chairs were either flimsy. So like somebody who is maybe of a higher weight, who's sensitized to the potential of like the fragility of a chair, might be able to sit down, but might feel nervous the entire time. So imagine for a second going to an event that you're excited about and all there are flimsy seats and you're sitting there trying to enjoy this event. And for 50 minutes, 90 minutes, whatever, you are preoccupied with the idea that this chair is so flimsy and like could fall apart. And then I think also another thing is like, arms, like the kind of the armrests on chairs. For a lot of bigger people, it creates extreme discomfort. Even at a restaurant, for example, this is something I work with a lot of women, and a number of them have told me one of the things that's so hard is they want to socialize with friends of all sizes, but when they go out with their friends or their thinner friends, they don't take into consideration the fact that some fat people can't fit into a booth. And so they don't feel comfortable going out with their friends because they don't want to have the conversation about why we can't sit at a booth, for example. Another thing that kind of is, again, more systemic, fat women face more job discrimination. And this is on the hiring side. I mean, fat men as well. Like this is sort of like a specifically gendered finding, but I think the same is true for men. But let's talk about women for a second. So in general, and the way that like workplace discrimination around fatness works is that fat women are less likely to get hired. And then may or may not experience a hostile work environment. So, for example, again, a big thing I've learned in working with women is that a lot of women have to deal with constant diet talk at the office. And diet talk looks like, oh, that thing is bad. Oh, this thing is so evil. Oh, I'm going to have to work really hard to work that off. I'm going to have to go to the gym tonight if I eat that. Oh, I can't eat that cake because, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. And this, that in and of itself, that seemingly innocuous diet talk at the office is another example of fat shame that happens constantly culturally. So let's say, there's a fat woman at the office, and, maybe it's likely that she's feeling particularly implicated in this conversation. All of these women are essentially saying, I want to do everything in my power not to look like you. That's kind of like what the underlying message sometimes becomes. And so if you think about the stress of work, the way that like work creates anxiety in people and all these kinds of things, and then add an extra level of the stress of your coworkers sort of subtly indicating to you that your body is unacceptable. Again, it creates like this further level of barred entry into joyful, gainful employment. And the list kind of keeps going. But that's kind of a broad swath of examples.
Yeah, I can't remember where I heard it, something about the fact that even with like crash test dummies are of a certain size, and basically they represent a tiny fraction of the society, and that the vast majority of people, when they're doing safety checks, aren't tested to see if they would even pass those safety checks.
Right, exactly.
And so how is this then playing out in terms of the discrimination and the problems that it's then causing?
I mean, it plays out in a lot of different ways. One finding that was particularly startling and interesting that I want to share with you is a paper was published in a journal. I can't remember the name of the journal right now, but it was in September of 2015. There was a paper published about the long-term effects of weight discrimination. And the study was done with two large sample sizes. I think one was 12,000 and one was 5,000. And they found that it was weight discrimination had a correlation with a decreased lifespan. Weight discrimination had a correlation with decreased heart health, and had a correlation with a suppressed immune system. These findings are completely in line with other research we've done about stigmatized groups. If you look into the body of theory called minority stress theory, or you look into stigma theory, but minority stress theory in particular has consistently found that there are very convincing and compelling correlations between daily experiences of discrimination and long-term negative health outcomes. I want to give you one example outside of the fat community where this finding was also made in the gay community in the United States. So they looked at gay men in the U.S. and compared them to their heterosexual counterparts. Interestingly, gay men on average tend to be more physically fit than their heterosexual counterparts, and yet they live shorter lives. And sort of like, this is interesting, right? So the researchers went in and they sort of ran all the numbers. They looked at the correlations. They looked at the demographics. They controlled for various potential conflicts. And they found that it was actually the experience of homophobia that was leading to these decreased lives and increased like possibilities of depression, et cetera, a number of other things. So if you think about it, and I just kind of want to bring it down to an individual level, one thing I always ask people is to think back to a time when they had a fight, whether it was a verbal fight or a physical fight, and think about all the responses your body has, right? Like, and when your body is in a stress response, your stomach restricts, your heartbeat starts to go up, you start to sweat, you're producing adrenaline. This is a stress response. Now imagine this stress response happening every day for years. And I think that you can begin to understand exactly how wearing this is on the body. And I think what's really important to recognize is that discrimination, the experience of fat phobia, is not just the moments when it's happening. It's not just that moment when somebody calls you a slur on the train. It's not just that moment when a coworker says something awful to you. It's all the moments that you're waiting for that moment to happen. And this is what's so important about discrimination. It's not just the moment. It's also all the rest of the moments, all the moments in between when you're waiting. And so I think, like, when I think about the most startling kind of ways in which this plays out, this is one of the most startling ways in which it plays out. And it sort of, for me, especially somebody who's like a social scientist and who spent a lot of time thinking about this and reading about this, it makes complete sense. It's in line with other discriminated groups. And I think that, for me, when I think about the other ways in which the discrimination stigma play out, it plays out. I mean, I want to talk about one more other finding, and then because there's so much I could say. One other finding that I found very compelling when I was doing my research in graduate school was that fat women are less likely to negotiate condom use and less likely to feel comfortable negotiating sex on their terms with their partners. And this is fascinating, right? Like, this has a public health implication. This is not only affecting an individual who doesn't feel like she has the right to demand that her body be kept safe by her partner because she's been taught that her body is worthless. This, if you extrapolate this out on a population scale, this becomes a public health concern. If people do not feel like they can ask for safer sex, this is a problem. And shaming people is leading to these outcomes. And what's so like fascinatingly ridiculous to me is that this whole war on obesity, fat shaming, culture-wide fat phobia is being fought under this banner of health. And it's a complete lie as far as I'm concerned. Just a couple weeks ago, I went into 2 undergraduate kinesiology classes. And kinesiology is kind of like the scientific side of the gym industry. I sort of see it that way. Like, these people are very interested in muscles and biochemistry and all the kinds of, and fitness, right? And I asked them, as people who I felt would be particularly well-versed in the notion of what health is, I gave each of them a piece of paper and I asked them to write down their definition of health. I gave them 3 minutes. And I asked them to send them back, to give them back to me. And I went through them, and there was a wildly diverse array of answers. Insofar as I could classify any of them as thematically very similar, I would say there were 9 categories. Out of 50 people, 9 categories emerged. And so I think that when, and again, this was not surprising to me, when I look at the way that this conversation is being sort of like apologized for under the notion that we're just concerned about people's health, we're just concerned about the nation's health, I don't believe that for a second, because we as a culture don't even agree on what this term means.
It's interesting you said all that, because I wrote a blog piece about that about 2 weeks ago. By the time that this is actually goes to air, it'll probably be about 6 weeks ago. But talking about the fact that the whole idea around about the obesogenic environment that we live in is so focused on the foods and the way that we've changed the living conditions in terms of we drive everywhere and all that. But no one ever pays attention to the way that we talk about fat and fat stigma and all of that, and how that then impacts on not only people putting on more weight, but then people having genuine health issues because of that fat stigma.
Right,
and
exactly.
There's some great research, again, looking at like one of the worst predictors for someone to have poor health is poverty. And obviously coming from poverty, yes, people have poorer access to good quality food and that side of things, but equally it's the lack of autonomy that that person then has, and the mental and emotional stress that they feel, which then goes in line with everything you've just said about gays and other underprivileged communities.
Yeah.
And so, you talk a lot about privilege, and it's something I'm becoming more aware of, and probably to the extent that I receive it. I mean, I'm male, I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm thin. I basically tick all of the privilege boxes, whereas for you would have had a very different experience. I mean, how important is starting to talk about privilege and understanding privilege in discrimination and what we've been chatting about?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things about privilege is that it often shelters the people who are beneficiaries of certain kinds of privilege from any awareness of these issues. And I mean, I'm going to talk about my own self, like in this moment, I think that I certainly, I grew up brown. I grew up like my family is Mexican. I grew up in kind of like a working class, like lower middle class neighborhood, and I grew up fat. And those things are all real. On the flip side, I went to an elite university. I've been granted the opportunity to travel a lot. I've had a lot of things that have, on the one hand, made me deeply aware of the experiences of people who have not had as much privilege. But on the other hand, I mean, I have blind spots as well. And I think this is the most interesting way in which privilege runs, and one of the biggest implications of privilege is that a lot of times we believe that we are, that we are not, like, essentially, I think my biggest concern about privilege is that we can walk through life without the awareness of the fact that we are potentially perpetuating really problematic and complex issues. So I think about, like, let's go back to the example that I was talking about earlier about office talk, like diet talk at the office. I know for I'm almost 100% certain that these coworkers who are talking about dieting really don't believe that they're having a negative impact. They really believe that they're just part of a greater conversation about health and a greater conversation about watching what you eat to pursue better health. These people are not malicious. These people are simply people who have been shielded from the impacts of this, like the worst outcomes of this kind of conversation. And I think it's that, like, and this is one of the things, like when I go and talk to people, especially I do a lot of talks at universities. I recently did a talk at a very affluent high school. And one of the things that was really amazing about talking with them was that many of them perhaps had experienced shame, had experienced body shaming, and had experienced the pain of feeling like their body didn't fit some kind of arbitrary ideal, but they didn't see that as a bad thing. They didn't see that as something that was negative. They didn't see it as something that could be changed. And I think a lot of times the more privileged someone is, the more invested they are in kind of the way that things run right now. And they might not see, they even though they might be experiencing the negative impacts, they have these other elements within them that buffer them from that, or they're so invested that they don't feel compelled to change it in some kind of way. And so I think this is where, like, this is where the conversation has the potential to shift, right? I mean, I don't know. I feel like I've kind of articulated, like, my concern about privilege. I'm, like, worried that I'm starting to ramble now. I don't know if that kind of really got to the heart of your question.
No, that has. I mean, for someone who is then like myself, who has privilege in, as I said, all these different boxes, like what should I be doing to then be helping that situation, or not further perpetuating the situation, but evening the playing field?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, and I think that this is a long-standing question for me as well. I mean, I'm still working through these things and these answers myself. I think the very first thing, and perhaps the most important thing, is to take a step back and take a moment to learn about this thing. And I think what's hard is, again, privilege buffers people from awareness of these issues. And so I think that when you get an opportunity to hear from someone or hear a perspective or something that is not like yourself, something that's coming from a different viewpoint, is to take a moment to read up on it, to think about it, to take a step back from your own life and imagine kind of imagine what life could be like for this person. And I think that that's so important, that element of compassion, not just that it's a politically worthwhile pursuit, but that it's a personally worthwhile pursuit to begin to understand what other people are going through. I also think that, even just like I was mentioning before about women who sometimes limit their lives because they don't feel comfortable in certain environments, like going out with the friends and being anxious about not being able to find a table where they can comfortably sit for dinner. It's really important to take that knowledge and to kind of bring it out into your own personal life, to take a second to recognize the people who maybe are interfacing with the culture differently than you, and to really begin to see, are there things that I can do right now? Is there something I can do right in this moment to support this person? And that might look like, it might be as simple as thinking about not sitting at a booth and sitting at a table where there are chairs at a restaurant. It could be something really simple like asking somebody who has different access needs than you, asking them to choose a venue, asking them to do it. And I think, like, on a grander scale, it begins to look like advocacy, right? Like seeing a vested interest, even though this is something that you don't identify with, that you can still have a vested interest in the well-being of that person, of other people. And I think that once you kind of take on that worldview that, like, we we are interdependent, that we have the potential to be advocates and support systems for people of all kinds, it is then that we begin to see sort of like the unraveling of privilege.
And with that in mind, I mean, I'm someone who tries to read as widely as possible. I watch tons of documentaries. I try and get different experiences so that it isn't just so blinkered. And it just thinking about that this year, I've been doing a lot more reading in regards to eating disorders, but looking at it from the whole gamut. And I think too often it's portrayed as this white middle class thing. It's always about thinness, and then looking at, well, how does this affect other nationalities or other people's experiences, as opposed to just hearing the one narrative about what happens with white women.
Right, exactly. No, and I think one thing that's really important, and this is kind of, I think, perhaps one of the most important things that I've realized about privilege is that even the beneficiaries of privilege that is largely based on, like, for example, with fat phobia, the thin privilege or body size privilege pivots upon a very, very negative, very historically grounded system of, rewards and punishments that women have been a disproportionate victim of. And so even people who are quote unquote beneficiaries of privilege are still suffering under the weight of its incredible impact and its incredible negative impact culturally. So I think it's important, it's important to distinguish between somebody who has more or less privilege. I think that it's important for both parties. But it's also important to blur that line, to stop seeing oneself as on this side of the line, on this side of the receiving end, and on the other. I think that we have to really begin to see this issue as a matrix, right? That even if you are a thin person who feels that they benefit extraordinarily from our obsession culturally with thinness, you are still dealing with the fact that, like, for a lot of people, they're dealing with the anxiety of becoming fat. A lot of people are dealing with the fact that, and I think even if you think about it on a grander scale, that we're suffering when other people suffer. Your life, due to fat shaming, it's possible that you will not get to be friends with wonderful people because of it. It's possible that your life will be limited in some way because of that fat shaming. And I sort of feel like, it's important to see this universal way in which we are impacted by these systems, and to not necessarily make that line so clear between the privileged and the less privileged.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point because, as you say, even if you are being privileged, you can be then living in that place of, what happens if I fall from grace? What happens if I then shift over into the other category? And
exactly.
That's not a nice place to live.
Yeah.
So you set up a hashtag called lose hate, not weight. Do you want to talk about this?
Yeah. So lose hate, not weight is kind of my mantra. It's it summarizes everything that I do. Essentially, I'm a believer that it is the ideology of self-hatred. It's the ideology that I will never be good enough that has no place in our culture. I think that I don't think that people so essentially people allocate a lot of resources to the pursuit of weight loss and the maintenance of a certain kind of body, a lot of resources. And those resources are being allocated largely out of a sense of fear, as you were mentioning, of falling from grace, a fear of not having the things that we want, like love and respect and visibility. And in my opinion, sort of weight loss and diet culture in general, fear is the biggest engine of the diet industry. And so essentially, it is my utter and complete conviction that fear will never get you what you want.
And I 100% agree.
Absolutely. And so I think so a lot of times when people say to me, I want to be thin, they often mean I want to be seen, I want to be loved, I want to be free, I want to be respected, I want to have access to things that really matter to me as a human being. And when they say I want to be thin, that's actually what they're saying a lot of the time. And so essentially I see people pursuing weight loss as actually a way of pursuing freedom, love, visibility, and respect. And it is only through kind of the loss of that fear. It's only through the loss of that hatred of ourselves and others that we can actually gain the things that matter to us most as human beings. And I think it's so unfortunate that that weight loss is sold to people, and particularly women, as the thing that will unlock all the things that we want, because it simply isn't true. And so like Lose, Hate, Not Weight is all about this idea of like eradicate the ideology that you're not good enough. Stop worrying about what your body looks like, because there's nothing wrong with your body.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, then no one loses weight or wants to lose weight in a vacuum. It's, as you say, there's certain reasons that they want to do that, where they'll meet someone, or they'll have better relationships, or they get the promotion, or wwhatever it may be. And I like the idea of like you can achieve all of those things without weight having to come off.
Absolutely. And I think what's so fascinating about it is like the more that we leave that old fear-based way behind, the more power, the more kind of momentum it gets culturally. And I think that we're kind of seeing this, like certainly in social media, the way that loving your body, self-acceptance becomes almost viral, because it just resonates entirely with people. Most people hate dieting. Most people hate watching what they eat and quote unquote exercising, and wasting all this time and doing this mind-numbing behavior. Most people hate it. And I think that what's so important is to listen to that part of you that doesn't like this, because at the end of the day, something that you hate doing is not something that you can, that I think you can really sustain for the most part, that isn't really nourishing or generative.
And even the funny thing about that is a lot of the behaviors people would actually keep up if they were doing them for a different reason or approaching it in a different way.
Yeah,
in terms of
absolutely.
People like, oh, I don't like exercising. I don't like exercising because I've always exercised to lose weight and it's never worked. Whereas if someone else is doing exercise and it's purely for fun, it's really easy for them to keep it up.
Absolutely. And this is in my opinion, one of the biggest travesties of diet culture. If you think about it, the word diet is just another word for food, and the word exercise is just another word for movement. And food and movement are things that we as human beings have had relationships to since the dawn of humanity. And it is through kind of the alienation, the commoditization of movement and food that we become alienated. We begin to have pathological relationships to the parts of us that are native to who we are as a species. And this just drives me nuts. And I think about to sort of speak about a personal experience, I was somebody who had a deeply pathological relationship with food and movement for years and years and years. And when I decided to leave diet culture, and decided to stop dieting, I couldn't even go for a walk without that pathological part of my mind going off. All of a sudden it's like, am I walking fast enough? Am I burning calories? How long should I walk? How many calories am I burning? Am I losing weight right now? And just kind of like that broken record in our minds. I couldn't even go outside for a walk without that thing going off. And so it took me a good 2 years before I could even leave my house and enjoy a day. And I live right by the Pacific Ocean. I couldn't even go enjoy the amazing beauty of the Pacific Ocean without that thing going off in my mind. And so I had to avoid these behaviors for a long time, for like 2 years, until finally that voice started to kind of diminish. But in my mind, I'm like, how insidious, how insidious is a system that takes from me my ability to enjoy going to the ocean, my ability from my own internal sense of what my body wants to do for the sake of pleasure or pain relief or whatever, that was taken from me through this like ridiculous, 200-year-old way of thinking. Anyway, all the things. Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, look, lose hate, not weight. It's great hashtag. What is it like for a woman like yourself on the internet and like on social media? Because I assume you have lots of trolls. I assume you receive pretty horrible messages. Like, how is that as an experience?
Yeah. I mean, in general, I would say most of my experiences are very, very positive.
Okay.
Most people, I would say like on a daily basis, I leave the day, I finish the day feeling very good, feeling like I've, like somebody has heard what I have to say and it's healing them in some way. It's making them feel good. And that's so exciting for me. I certainly do. I have like a dedicated hate page on Reddit now. And it's just like, I mean, for me, on the one hand, I'm like, okay, these people are like following my every move, right? Like, I mean, I write a blog post and then they write kind of this weird, like counterpoint to my blog post.
Wow.
And there's a part of me that kind of, is sort of amused by it. I've got like a moniker on Reddit I'm like the Queen of Delusion. That's my moniker.
Wow.
And what's I mean, for me, like, and again, I'm such a nerd and such a like sort of analytically, scientifically minded person in a lot of ways, especially around emotion. That I'm largely fascinated. Like one of the ways that I deal with cultural issues like fat phobia or this Reddit community is that I take a step back and kind of take up an anthropological perspective on the whole situation, and I'm like, what can I learn from this? And so what I found particularly fascinating about the Reddit groups sort of preoccupation with my work is the nuanced way in which they are dealing with me. And that is, so for example, in the moniker Queen of Delusion, you'll notice that there's no reference to my body size. There's no reference to whether I'm beautiful or not. This is literally a reference to my sanity. And this is a very sophisticated sexist way in which like men have treated women for a very long time historically. So I see this sort of like, they sort of, there's almost like an understanding that I'm not, that I don't have insecurities about whether or not I'm beautiful, because it's not my job as a woman to be beautiful. It's not anybody's job to be beautiful. But specifically, they want to undermine my ability to understand the world. They want to undermine my understanding of my own, what's happening in my own life. And so again, this is interesting because it's like a little more sophisticated than the, like, you're ugly or you're fat or whatever, which I would say most people on the internet are doing. So I'm sort of like, I mean, it's weird. Like I'm sort of sickly fascinated by some of the stuff, like, and the ways in which it manifests and the ways in which particular kinds of groups attack me. Cause I mean, for the most part, one of the things that's very difficult is like when I have a high visibility day or week, like for example, if I'm on Yahoo front page or I'm on TV or something like that, there'll be spikes in, really intense trolling behavior. And I think what's really, really hard for me is they'll go in and they'll look at my hashtag lose hate not weight, and then they'll go in and attack every person who has tagged that. And I mean, if you go on Instagram right now, you'll see that there's about 50,000 images that have been tagged with lose hate not weight, and a dedicated minority will go in and they will go to every single one and they will write something mean at least once, if not 8 or 9 times. And so I think that's the part that's probably the most difficult for me to deal with, is like knowing that, that it's me that they're upset with, but they'll go after everybody as this kind of like really intense, punishing, alienating behavior. But again, I feel largely that the sort of feedback I get is very positive. And in general, and this is like the last thing that I'm going to say about this issue, but I've gotten to a point, at least right now, where I sort of see, like, I feel I feel a lot of conviction in where I stand in the world. I feel like I'm very aware that a bigot is a bigot and that it's not my fault that somebody is calling me a name and I do not deserve it and that it is not true. And that at the end of the day, what somebody has to say to me, if it's negative or mean-spirited, it's about them, and it has nothing to do with me. I simply happen to be, I'm almost like a reflective surface of their own self-hatred, their own concerns, their own anxieties. And usually I can bring that understanding and that compassion to these experiences online.
Yeah. And I guess there's days that are easier and there's days that are tougher with that stuff. Yes. I remember doing, like, looking up, I think it was Reagan Chastain, like searching her name, and I found like her website, and then there was like another 10 or 20 blogs all talking about how she's wrong and just really going against her and attacking her, and just the thought of like, how much time do people have on their hands that they're doing this? Like, what do they hope to accomplish from shaming this person or from writing this stuff? Like, like the mind boggles at these people and what they're doing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's really important to add that this is heavily gendered behavior.
Oh,
that
totally.
It's mostly women who get attacked online, and it's mostly men. Certainly in the high-profile sort of doxing cases, it's almost exclusively men who are doing this. I don't want to say that women never do this. Certainly I've experienced women being very, very vitriolic to me. But I think it's important to recognize that whether it's a man or a woman or a person of a different gender who is attacking someone, that person, the recipient of the attack, is almost certainly going to be a woman.
Yeah, I can't remember who posted about it, but talking about he was a man who talks for women's rights, and he said he gets some trolls and attacked, but in comparison to the women who talk about the exact same thing he talks about, it's nothing. Like, they get just the most hate-filled, horrible messages, and just, how horrible that is.
Yeah.
So you've got a program called BABECAMP. Do you want to tell people what this is all about?
Yeah. So BABECAMP currently is a 4-week virtual intensive where I work with people who are ready to break up with diet culture, and I hold their hand through the experience. And kind of the ultimate goal is to kind of take up your destiny as a babe in this world. And for me, certainly, a babe means someone who is living their life on their own terms, doing what works for them, and pursuing those things doggedly, right? Pursuing what excites and nourishes them doggedly. And so right now the program is online. It happens 2 to 3 times a year. I'm having a session coming up in April 4th through 30th. Anyone in the world can participate. And what happens is that for 30 days, for 4 weeks, I send people an email every day, and in each email, there's kind of there's like not only a new kind of lesson, something to think about, there's also an activity that's 5 to 10 minutes long that helps sort of solidify the sort of the lesson that I was teaching that day. And then every weekend, so every Saturday, we do a group call that's an hour long. So everybody is welcome to come into the teleconference, and we have kind of a forum style conversation where we ask questions, where we talk about our week, we talk about tools that we've built or developing. And then at the end, you get a certificate. So it's kind of, I mean, it's like, I really love this program. It's a year of this. In December this month, it's officially 1 year old, and I've worked with 150 students from all over the world. And what's so exciting is, when we get on the group call and people are saying where they're from, and it's like Germany, Canada, Australia, wherever, New York, New Jersey, and Mexico. And it's just, it's like there's something really exhilarating about hearing other people's voices, and also recognizing that this is like a global issue. This is something that people all over the world are working through, and that there's kind of this like universality of the experience that we share so much, even though we're thousands of miles apart, that we share these things in common, and that we share our drive to heal also in common. And then I'm really excited because I'm putting into motion having a live retreat in Jamaica next November, so November 2016. And I'm hoping to make the live retreat a consistent part of BABECAMP. So it's going to be kind of a new element in the BABECAMP program.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Cool. So for people who want to find out more about you, where should they be going?
I would say my website is kind of everything. It's virgietovar.com, VIRGIE, T as in Tom, O, V as in Victor, AR.com. You can find out about, what's going on. I have a calendar page. I have a BABECAMP page. I have a blog page. If you're interested in following me in social media, I'm at Virgie Tovar on Twitter and Instagram. And you can find me on Facebook as well under Lose Hate Not Weight or Virgie Tovar.
Perfect. Well, I will put all of those links in the show notes. But Virgie, it's been wonderful chatting with you. It's just great to hear your take on all of these different things in terms of weight discrimination and privilege. And yeah, I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much. I did too.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.